This is the appointed time. We have a quorum. So let's make a start. We're using the electronic voting system today, so please remain in the seat you've chosen. Let's invite the administration to come in. At the last meeting of the 16th of May, members began examining the provisions of Cap 127 Foreshore and Seabed Reclamations Ordinance. The Bills Committee will start with the Chinese version of the marked up copy of the bill, page 52, CB bracket 165/2023 bracket 01. So this is the page on which we will resume, page 52. The legal advisor will be checking the English version for us. At the same time, members, if you have questions, please press the request to speak button. May I remind the administration to facilitate our work when you go through the provisions, please quote the page number of the marked up copy. Let me welcome the administration, Permanent Secretary, who will help us with the examination, please. We should resume at page 52, 0052. Good morning, Chairman, members. We stopped at 16A, minor works, on page 52 of Cap 127. We thank members for their views on minor works and also what items to be included in the list of minor works. We are discussing with the relevant works department, and we should be able to give members a reply before the next meeting. So let's resume. Section 16A, subsection 2. With the Director's authorization, no person shall have the right to claim compensation. I thank the legal advisor for raising an issue with 16A to B. Whether this covers the following scenario. During the construction stage, will claims relating to damage caused to another person's property be dealt with? When we replied to this question on the 16th of May, we already laid out our thoughts. We do not intend to prevent any person from making a claim against any damage to the property during the construction stage. We're discussing with the Department of Justice to see how this intention can be, or non-intention can be, better reflected. Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Chair. To follow up on what Fabia said, we're talking about damage to the property of a third party when works are in progress. Definitely, a contractor will be involved. We're not just talking about works carried out by the department. So I suppose a third-party insurance will be taken out because the government should have an agreement with the contractor. Yes, I think Mr. Andrew Lam has pointed out what happens in reality. We have various works projects in progress, and when a contractor undertakes a government project, a contract will be signed with terms and conditions relating to the liability of the contractor in the event of damage to property of a third party. So as far as the law is concerned, if there is no intention to bar anyone making such a claim, the member has just suggested providing greater clarity. We are mulling over this issue, but what Mr. Lam said just now is actually what happens now. Dr. Wendy Hong. I'd like the administration to further explain the minor works mechanism. Apart from the Foreshore and Seabed Reclamations Ordinance, there are also similar mechanisms in, say, other pieces of legislation. For example, if the affected area is less than 0.5 hectares in another piece of legislation not relating to reclamation, then the same applies. The minor works here refers to three major ordinances: the Railways Ordinance, the Foreshore and Seabed Reclamations Ordinance, and also the Road Works Compensation and Use Ordinance. The member has put it rightly. We're going to adopt the same mechanism for the three ordinances. Nobody should make a claim for compensation against the government under the minor works mechanism. The rationale is that the minor works are usually carried out on a very small scale with few people affected. The purpose of the minor works mechanism is to take forward certain works in a more expeditious and effective manner. For example, the Highways Department, there are works, minor works for the purpose of emergency repairs. And that's the rationale behind the minor works mechanism. For major infrastructure projects, there is another mechanism detailing the compensation arrangements. We don't think this is consistent with the policy objective here. But to answer members' question, is it that in reality we're unable to handle claims relating to damage caused to the property of another person? As I explained, that is not the case. We've laid out our thoughts on compensation matters relating to minor works. Perhaps the administration should further elaborate on the following. As raised by the legal advisor, say if the minor works do not affect the land title and the rights of the owners in the land resumption exercise, for example, the land resumption ordinance can be invoked for compensation to be made out. Now, the person may not be affected by the project itself, but then loss may be incurred as a result of minor works. So you should clarify the position here. What about the rights of a person in making a claim? I think this is an area of concern. Mr. Andrew Lam. Chairman, you've actually asked the question I had in mind. Please continue. Yes? Legal advisor. Minor works mechanism applies to the Railways Ordinance as well as the Road Works Compensation and Use Ordinance. The government should make consequential amendments to the two subsequent ordinances. Dr. Wendy Hong, can you tell us, in the form of a table, the list of minor works under the three ordinances? For example, in terms of the scale of the works to be regarded as minor works, and also the nitty-gritty, can you show us? For our benefit, yes. Anything else? If not, please continue. And then 16A, subsection 3. For minor works authorized by the Director of Lands, there is no need to make a plan and handle the objections. So these sections do not apply to this mechanism. And then subsection 4, for the minor works contained in the schedule, it can be amended subject to a notice published by the Gazette by the Secretary. So much for minor works under section 16A. But basically, you're still bound by this framework in the schedule, because the overarching rule is that the affected area should be less than 0.5 hectares. So you still need to fulfill these conditions. Right. This major rule remains unchanged. For the schedule, may I refer members to page 55. 55 shows the schedule. If amendments are needed, and we are considering the suggestions put forward by members at the same time, and see if the amendments can be dealt with in this exercise. If need be, we will move committee stage amendments. But let's say 2 or 3 years down the road, if we want to make further changes to the list in this schedule, the Secretary can publish a notice in the Gazette to amend the notice.
Thank you, Deputy Chairman. I have the same question as you do. Section 16, subsection 4, amending the schedule. So if we add anything to the schedule that does not affect the half a hectare requirement under subsection 1 of section 16A. Under subsection 4, any changes to the schedule is something that the Secretary for Development can do at will. Do we have a framework on what we can add to schedule and what's off limits other than the half a hectare requirements? So are there other restrictions? To address Mr. Chen's question, so the Secretary will not just arbitrarily change the list of items on the schedule. We put the schedule there after thorough discussions with members. Future amendments will go through the same process. This means going through the electrical with the agreement of the panel, and then we go ahead. And then there will be a Gazetted notice and go through a negative vetting procedure. So in the end, the Legislative Council will get to look at the list and give comments before the Secretary publishes a notice in the Gazette to make changes to the schedule. So members will get to look at the list before it's gazetted. Mr. Louis Long. Chair, I want to follow up on the mechanism. So the proposed changes will go to the panel beforehand, or will they go through the negative vetting procedure? Ms. Tam? We can submit a proposal to the panel on development. That is, if we do change the items on the schedule and then we can have a panel discussion, that can be done. So this will not be negative vetting. I think we can talk about it first. We forge a consensus on how we make the changes, and then we proceed with the amendment. Mr. Chen Xiu-Hong, I'm following up on the same thing. So the idea is the Secretary follows their usual practice. The Secretary consults the relevant panel and then decides how to change the items. Good intentions indeed, but then if the Secretary thinks there's no need for a discussion and goes ahead to change the schedule, what are some mechanisms that will require the Secretary to go through the panel? For the panel, we may have up to 10 or 12 meetings per year. the provision here is drafted in such a way that the secretary gets to decide. Can we get the legal advisor to clarify this point? Thank you. Here it says the secretary may, by notice published in the Gazette, amend the schedule. The legal effect is that negative vetting will apply. The change will be tabled at the electrical. Electrical members will get to scrutinize the change. So that's the legal effect. So is that the intention of the government? Thank you, Chair. Indeed, as Fabia was saying, when there's a need to amend the schedule, we first table the proposal at the panel on development. We have a discussion to see if members have comments. Once we agree on how to proceed, say we want to add or remove something on the list, and then we go through the legislative procedure. As the legal advisor was saying, this will be a negative vetting procedure. So we're all clear on this. Fabia, please continue. Section 16B. Now, under Cap 124, the Lands Resumption Ordinance, we covered the same point. For reclamation, even before the works expenditure is approved by the Finance Committee, we can invoke Section 16B to deal with reclamations. This is what we have already seen under Cap 124. Please continue. Section 16C. At the last meeting, we covered a similar point. So, without a draft plan, we can go ahead with the steps for reclamation. All clear? Please continue. Page 54. Transitional provisions. There are 3 subsections. We're defining certain terms. First, that's subsection 1. On the notices, the new objection handling mechanism, and also we're shortening a time frame from 2 + 9 months to 2 + 5 months in terms of handling objections. Before the bill takes effect, works were already gazetted. Those projects will be dealt with under the old regime. Now, the subsection 2, we are introducing a new interest rate system. So for projects already gazetted before the bill takes effect, they would fall under the old interest rate regime. Please continue. Page 55. That's the schedule we were talking about. No questions from members. I believe then we are done with Cap 127 for clause-by-clause scrutiny. For the next piece of legislation, that's Cap 370. Who's going to walk us through the bill, please? I refer members to page 172. So this is the Roads, Works, Use and Compensation Ordinance Cap 370. We have prepared slides to help us. Now, some key changes. We want to expand the minor works mechanism under this ordinance. Now, some background here. We want to make use of the minor works mechanism to deal with minor works swiftly in a simple way. The mechanism has been around for 3 to 4 decades. It's a helpful mechanism with road works. Some departments are involved, the Civil Engineering Development Department and Highways Department. On a day-to-day basis, those departments use this mechanism. With this amendment exercise, we're looking for room to expand the mechanism. The mechanism was introduced at a time that was vastly different from the circumstances of today. So things have changed. The mechanism back then cannot cope with the needs of today. So we're looking for ways to improve the system. On the slide, you can see that on the left, what counts as minor works. 2 points here. So the Secretary for Transport and Logistics has to believe that it's a small-scale operation or involving small-scale structures. And the second point, minor works cannot affect resumption or involve the creation of easements or other rights. This means the minor works should not affect those rights. When those rights come up in a major project, there are claims mechanisms. So this time we define what minor works by looking at the scale. We also look at the impact in deciding what counts as minor works. The proposal is on the right, a box in the middle. One more factor to consider: works causing minimal adverse effect on the people nearby or commuters. That makes a project a minor works. We will also get to that when we delve into the clauses. Legal advisor put a question to us. So, what does minimal adverse effect mean? What will we consider in deciding what counts as that? Now, there are things we will be looking at. First, the nature, the scope. Minor works are what you see in a district. So they will not affect the trunk roads, major routes. Second, whether they will be unreasonably affect the commuters or residents nearby. The idea is this. Say, will that lead to the cancellation of certain bus stops or minibus stops, or whether the project will lead to a serious detour for local residents. When those things happen, then the project will not count as minor works. The third point that we take into account is whether there will be a major visual impact for local residents. During works, there are piles. They may be close to where people live. The piles may block residents' views. When that happens, the project is not minor works. We go by the existing mechanisms. Gazetted, there's a statutory procedure for handling objections to such works. Members may wonder, are we expanding the mechanism such that departments get more power? They can somehow bypass Gazetted to start works. Now, here are some things you can consider. First, as a matter of law, we're not changing the fundamental principles. So no resumption, not creating any easements or other rights. We're not changing this principle. Second, our experience shows that the minor works mechanism has been in place for more than 4 decades. Over the years, our frontline officers haven't had a situation where the residents question why a certain project was not gazetted. So our frontline officers have taken a prudent approach to what they do. That's the second point. Now, the third point, there are checks at the administrative level. For minor works involving, say, the highways department, you need a chief engineer to approve the project. So we will not see a case where a frontline officer gets to skip Gazetted because they feel like doing it. There is oversight from a more senior officer who is more experienced, so there is an administrative check on the process. And there will also be continued departmental communication, unless we're talking about emergency repairs. Unless that happens, even for minor works, department will let the residents know. May talk to the owners corporations or the rural village representatives. When needed, the matter will also be discussed at district council. Such practices will be incorporated into administrative guidelines. On the websites of the Development Bureau and the Civil Engineering Development Bureau, you can find that guideline. So these considerations and these checks will be reflected in the administrative guidelines. So that's to address members' potential concerns that we are giving departments too much power or expanding the mechanism. For members wish to put questions.
Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Chairman. I understand what the law says. It is not a departure from the existing mechanism, only that the scope is now wider. It's for the administration to make a judgment. But if we consider minimal adverse impact on commuters and residents, this is different from reclamation. To take this example, in the new territories, the minor works projects may cause drainage problems. This may lead to flooding and noise issues. We often hear about complaints of this nature. So, again, reference should be made to the guidelines. Very often, the subcontractors will have to deal with the actual issues. So you need to draw on previous experience and provide greater clarity when it comes to issues like insurance. Yes, we'll see to that. Mr. Louis Long. Chairman, I have some questions on terminology. It's a point of clarification. First, commuters. Do you mean to say those using the road? Okay, how about you ask all the questions you have first? First term, commuters. Second, the people in the neighborhood. How do you define people in the neighborhood? What's the area involved? And then the third expression, minimal adverse effect. Pardon my Chinese, but does it mean that definitely there will be an impact on these people, only that it should only have a minimal adverse effects? On B, I see that there is an addition. Right. Mr. Long, you can save the point on B when we come to the clause by clause, but it's relevant because I see Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. It seems that the so-called adverse effect only applies to those using the roads. What about the noise impact, visual impact? Are they not covered under this section? Right, please explain the terminology. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Long. About these several expressions, minimal adverse impact, and then commuters, and then the people in the neighborhood. As far as the law is concerned, we admit that it is difficult to provide a clear definition. But at the same time, we're given the flexibility we need to carry out minor works. To explain our thoughts, commuters means those working nearby, and then people in the neighborhood. By this expression, we mean to say the area of influence set out in, say, a traffic impact assessment, when the authority will consider the impact on the road network nearby and the control of road sections and the extent of impact on these areas. As per the existing mechanism, we cannot clearly define whether it covers, say, 100 meters in diameter. That depends on the layout in the area. The principle is we'll conduct traffic impact assessments to gauge the impact in the neighboring area. For people in the neighborhood, this is usually referred to as residents as well as shop operators. Minimal adverse effects, that means the impact should be minimal. Now, for example, if the project involves a shift of the position of bus stops and loading and unloading points, if we're talking about moving them to somewhere off their original position in the same section, then the impact would be minimal. But if we're talking about scrapping the loading and unloading points, then that will cause something more than a minimal effect. So does it answer your question on 2B, or B2 rather? So it's still about the use of the roads. Say if the minor works generates a lot of noise, then it is not subject to this provision. Allow me to take this question. As per the existing practice, when works are in progress, if we find impact on the say if we find that there is a noise or visual impact, we'll ask for remedial measures to be put in place. When considering whether the works constitute minor works and that there will be adverse impact on commuters and people in the neighborhood, we also consider the visual impact. In all fairness, if indeed the works cause a negative visual impact, say if the sight line outside somebody's windows is blocked, then we believe that the mechanism should cover such scenarios. Mr. Lau Guo-fan, I support expanding the scope of the minor works mechanism and provide more flexibility. I understand you have specific descriptions such as minimal adverse effect on commuters and people in the neighborhood. But the question is really whether those granting approval will dare to rely on these points. Because in actual operation, the rules should be simple. say in the event of a land resumption, the minor works should be small in scale. The structure should be relatively simple. As to whether you envisage objections in the previous political atmosphere, it was quite impossible not to have any opposing views or objections. So despite having an objection handling mechanism, this is rarely invoked. Now you have greater clarity. But I wonder if the previous problems will continue. In other words, despite having this mechanism in place, will your colleagues dare to invoke it? Because previously the problem has been that your colleagues dare not invoke that mechanism. So that's the first point. Second, the works should not involve land resumption or the creation of easement. Say for public works, the area of land to be resumed may be minimal. You may have sought consent from all the villages and landowners. Still, does it mean that the works will have to be carried out subject to statutory gazettal and not covered by the minor works mechanism? So basically, Mr. Lau was asking about works covered under the minor works mechanism. Let me explain it in this way. For Highways Department, they undertake close to 10,000 minor works projects every year. The member mentioned the minor works mechanism already in place, and yet it is not effective. We don't agree because, as the figures show, it is effective. It's a matter of culture and atmosphere. As this society now allows rational discussion, I believe our frontline colleagues will be able to invoke the mechanism. The minor works mechanism has been in place for 40 years. We have accumulated experience in the process, and times have changed. I believe the department colleagues will be able to use this objection handling mechanism with ease. Anyway, with the passage of the bill, we will be briefing our colleagues. We'll also encourage them, as per the administrative guidelines, to strive to make use of the minor works mechanism. Mr. Lau also asked about private projects. Despite a small piece of land being resumed, whether the minor works mechanism can be invoked. I think as the conditions suggest, the minor works should not involve land resumption or the creation of easement. So this is a prerequisite. We don't intend to change it. But in the future, we may consider amending the condition to keep up with the times if necessary. So is it that after the amendment you are expanding the scope of minor works and then some works will not be subject to gazettal? Let me explain with the illustration of this diagram. This example. Without having to go through the statutory gazettal, we managed to complete this project. This is the area close to the public pier in Yongxuan for the cycle parking area. It's covered by the minor works project. As the existing ordinance stands, since the area is quite large, members at the time felt that Gazetted was still necessary and minor works mechanism could not be invoked. We did not receive objection. But if this bill is passed, this project will fall under the new mechanism. So, as you explained, in fact, this project could have been covered by the mechanism, only that the perception of your colleagues affected the judgment. So you need to instill confidence in them so that they can really make use of this mechanism. You should provide guidance in the guidelines because as per the existing ordinance, do you agree that in fact this project could have been covered by the minor works mechanism? Well, the definition of minor works has been put in place for a long time. It has been followed by our frontline colleagues. The Development Bureau would like to encourage frontline colleagues to make better use of the mechanism, especially for projects to bring the public more benefits without objections, so that these projects can be covered by the relevant provisions. So what we will do is that internally we will step up publicity to encourage them to make better use of the mechanism. And after the bill is passed at the district level, do tell us what projects can be covered under the mechanism so that we can make a bolder step. I do look forward to a change in culture. Well, you talked about the project being small in scale, and if the site is large, then there is a concern whether it remains a minor works project. Because you need to consider factors such as whether it creates an adverse effect.
Dr. Wendy Hong. I want to find out more about the internal administrative guidelines. The government told us about approval from the chief engineering, but will the secretary be making the decision in the end? Ms. Tam? Now, at the Highways Department, a chief engineer's approval is good enough. Getting the secretary to approve minor works may do little to boost speed and efficiency. We have more than 10,000 such works every year. Page 172 of the marked up copy, bracket A, that in the secretary's opinion, to clarify, will the secretary be making the final decision? Ms. Tam. This is already in action. Under Cap 370, the minor works work like this. The secretary delegated power to the frontline works department. Then the frontline departments do the work. That mechanism will stay the same even after this bill is passed. Then the Secretary for Transport and Logistics delegated power to a department, and then that officer with the delegated power, say the Director of Highways or the Director of Civil Engineering Development, will make the decision. But what if Gazette was needed? That will require a different process. So without Gazette, a chief engineer can make a decision. And if a Gazette is needed, the matter goes back to the Policy Bureau. Mr. Chen Xiu-hong. Thank you. Writing on Mr. Louis Long's point, the word here is commuter. Well, that term left me scratching my head. The English term is commuter. Why don't you use a common term, road users? Works mean closing a road. Road users will be clearer. You don't even have to define that term. Can the government give some thought to this term instead? We support this idea of the change, because there will be flexibility for the department or the bureau to handle minor works. the amendment is also about putting some restrictions on the process. The terms are defined, and then the departments will be more comfortable with going ahead with the minor works. But here it says only causing minimal adverse effect on the commuters and people in the neighborhood. My worry is that it may lead to more uncertainty. What does it mean by minor and adverse? You close a road, you have to do, say, a traffic impact assessment. Is the TIA good enough? Or will the presence of an alternative route be good enough in determining what a minimal adverse effect is? That term is slippery. Let's take the example of the Foreshore and Seabed Reclamations Ordinance. Under that ordinance, the rule is clear: half a hectare. The works is smaller than half a hectare, and that's good. But here, when it comes to road closure, is there an objective standard, say a certain length in terms of kilometers, or will TIA be required to tell what minimal adverse effect is? That way, officials can exercise a long-standing power. If you don't spell things out clearly, you open yourself to questions, and then the officials and officers hesitate to invoke the law. In this case, I don't see how the department can be assured in invoking the minor works mechanism. So my worry is adding this provision here may do little to assure officials. So will there be a more objective requirement or criteria? Thank you. Now on the term road user, we considered using it. But this term may be too broad. Road users may cover anyone who may use the road. As we said, minor works are focused on a particular district. Anyone who walks by is a road user. The term is too broad. So departments will wonder whether they can use the power under Roman numeral 2. I'm sorry, my concern is the term commuters is even broader. But when we say commuters, we're talking about people who pass by the area as they go to and from work. So we look at whether there are commercial buildings nearby, and then we consider the travel pattern of commuters. Our goal is to be fair to the community. And we want to minimize the impact of works on the local community. That's what the minor works mechanism is there. This is about striking a balance. Chair, I get it, but the problem with commuters is then there is a relevance point here. You can simply say the relevant road users. Can that be done? Can you give it some thought after the meeting? I'm saying I want to make this clearer to readers. I'm sorry, Chairman. My second question was not answered. I thank the member for his question. We will explore with the Department of Justice. We will explore the use of the term relevant road users in place of commuters. Now, on the requirement of a traffic impact assessment, for large projects, TIAs will apply. Now, for minor works, though, we may not do such a study. But for sure, there will be traffic reviews which are of a smaller scale. For the roads affected by a project, there will be an area setting out what's affected. but it's hard to put a figure on it, say 100 meters radius, because the effect, or rather the impact of the project may go beyond that area. We can trust the Works Department to stick to this current approach, so that's how it works. Chairman, I want to use the example on the slide. With the amendment proposed here, how can the change here assure the officers in charge to go ahead with the works? The provision here says minimal adverse effect, but the traffic review is done anyway. Will the addition of these terms actually assure the officers in charge to go ahead? Otherwise, you end up making an unnecessary move. Permanent Secretary. Thank you. I thank the member for his comment. Let's look at the existing provision. There are only two conditions under the current law. First, works minor in nature, not involving land resumption. Our experience shows that the technical department adopts this line of thinking. If it's a small scale operation, then we can invoke the minor works mechanism. That's their line of thought. But we have seen projects where the scale was not small, but then when the works began, the impact was limited on the people nearby and the commuters. So can we relax the requirements for those projects? Projects that are not small in scale, but they come with limited impact on the people nearby. Does it make sense to apply a minor works mechanism to those projects? That's why we put in the Roman numeral 2. This is what we want to achieve. In our thought process, we talked to the Highways Department and the CEDD. Just then, another member wondered if we will be comfortable using the power after introducing this provision. Of course, we will remind the Works Departments to invoke it. But there is also buy-in. In the past, Gazetted was required, and then after this bill is passed, the Works Department can skip the Gazetted. So we have secured the support of the Works Department. That makes it more likely for the Works Department to invoke the power once the bill is passed. So there is real significance in inserting the provisions under Roman numeral 2. That's from our experience. Next, Mr. Ambrose Lam. Mr. Chen Xiu-hong has already asked the question I had in mind. But since other members share the concern, I think it makes sense for me to raise this question too. I think I've come across the term commuter at some point. Then I checked the English text, and then I looked up the term. So this term comes up from what looks like a Japanese-Chinese dictionary. So my question is, does the term commuter feature in other ordinances? And as Mr. Chen was saying, why aren't we adopting the term road users? We have a rich vocabulary in Chinese. It's okay to use more characters, but it's a more common term. Not everyone has the money to go traveling. Chairman, anything to add from the government? The government said they will look into it. We will look into the use of the wording. Next, Mr. Louis Long. Just then, the permanent secretary made a point. Under bracket A, Roman numeral 2, that provision should stay. But Mr. Chen Xiu-hong also made a valid point. So let's not get hung up over the term commuter or road users. Roman numeral 2. Can we switch things around? So can we move up the wording in the neighborhood so that it reads, it will cause a minimal adverse effect on the people and commuters only in the neighborhood. So that way you spell out clearly it's only about the effect on people nearby or in the neighborhood. Will that clear things up? Well, that's something the government can consider too. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam. Chair, I have the same question. When I saw commuters, I think of people who have to use the road. So for the government, can you give us clear definitions or possible relevant cases? And now I turn to the point of whether departmental officers are comfortable invoking the power. But I'm skeptical about whether a change in the law can drive a change in the practice. Now let me use an imperfect analog. It may be exaggerated. Say in a village, you have to take or rather resume a certain plot of land with a feng shui tree, and then leading to a dog falling sick. I take the dog to a vet. The bill is $5,000. Now it's a real story, slightly dramatized, and then the frontline officers get cold feet and decides against going ahead with the works. I support expanding the mechanism, but how can you drive a change in the culture, the practice, through your administrative guidelines? Now, I gave you a deliberately ludicrous example, but this can happen. Customs, practices, they vary from place to place. So for the administration, you need to have such possibilities in mind, and then you work through the civil service college, bring about the cultural change in the civil service.
But to summarize, I think most members want to make sure that the amendment will work effectively, and that indeed there is no need to go through the Gazetted procedure so as to speed things up. Mr. Chen Xiu-hong, I thank the Permanent Secretary for explaining things to me. Now I understand the rationale behind A2. But I think that this may still be confusing. For example, like the Permanent Secretary said, there may be some large-scale projects meeting the requirements such as creating only the minimal adverse effects on people in the neighborhood, and that the colleagues are encouraged to invoke the mechanism. But how it is put is that if it is not minor works but major works, meeting these requirements and put under this section with the title minor works, it may be confusing for readers. Why is it that under this section minor works you can invoke the mechanism for a project that is not minor? Because otherwise you should take these out. That means if in the Secretary's opinion these works, albeit not minor in scale, can only create a minimal adverse effect, so on and so forth, then the Secretary can exercise the power. As Permanent Secretary, you should go back and think about it. Otherwise, it seems to me that if you include a non-minor works project under the heading of minor works project, it may be problematic. I thank Mr. Chair for his comment. This is reasonable. We'll go back and see how we can fine-tune the drafting of this provision. Now, members have expressed their views. I think that it is agreed upon that the scope should be as wide as possible. If you set this framework, there is a concern on implementation, and some members also raised a point about the culture. If there are no other comments, we can start going through the clauses. Okay, page 172. We just had a full discussion on amendments to this section, minor works. So section 4(1)(a), as explained, especially for A1, we've not made changes to this provision. And then A2 is a new provision, only create minimal adverse effect on the commuters and the people in the neighborhood. We'll go back and think again how we can improve this expression. The other major change is that we have paraphrased section 4 to improve clarity, and that means the principle. For example, for minor works, they should not touch upon land resumption, creation of easement, and the Secretary's power should be confined to road closure. We have paraphrased this provision to improve drafting. Mr. Chan Sil-hung. Well, the original provision provides that the Secretary may execute any works. Well, this is kept, and then you have the conditions, minor physical structural operations, or only create minimal adverse effects, so on and so forth, as conditions for invoking the mechanism. But why is it that for B, in respect of which the only powers required by the Secretary are any one or more of the following? Why do you need to repeat this phrase? Because the whole section relates to minor works. Is there any thinking behind this special expression? In respect of which, meaning the works. Right, we'll go back and consider this provision in respect of which, that's the expression. We'll go back and discuss with the Department of Justice. We're not making any change in the substance. We'll go back and see whether we can make it more concise and easy to understand. Well, because the original provision doesn't refer to in respect of so-and-so, please go back and consider my suggestion. Page 173. I do have a question. Section 4, subsection 3, in the English version, I see you have kept this term, the Crown. Any special reason for that? I will go through that in a moment. Cap 370 has been in place for a long time without changes. Some terms are obsolete. We will undertake an exercise to make changes to different terms, including this word, the Crown. I see you've proposed changes to different terms, but I find it quite peculiar that you're keeping the word the Crown here. Page 173, section 8, about publication of notice. We will introduce a new requirement for it to be published on the website, and we will also be keeping the original requirements, that is for the notice to be published in newspapers. Page 174. No amendment to the Chinese version. In subsection 4, you will see district council here. In the English version, however, it is worded at district board, so we will change that to district council instead. Page 175, section 10, objections. In relation to the objection handling mechanism, we are making changes to the time frame and the requirements. So we've added new provisions from subsections 3 all the way to 11. Subsections 3 in Cap 124, 127, we've covered that point. That is about objections relating to compensation or financial assistance. And then subsection 5, after providing a written reply to the objector should give a response to the government within 14 days after the date of reply. And then we have not made changes to the subsequent subsections. For subsections 10 and 11, again, reference to the objection handling mechanism about the correspondence. And then section 11, procedure after publication of plan and scheme. As mentioned just now, we will shorten the time frame from 2 + 9 to 2 + 5. And that means 1AB, subsection A, as you will see, 5 months here. And then after publication of a plan, there may be changes. And if there is objection, according to 81AC, you need to go by the 2-month period following which the objection should be submitted to the Senior Council for consideration. So this provision provides the time frame within which the objection should be submitted to the Senior Council. That's for 1ABB. For 1AC, for extension applications, the original provision provides that the Chief Executive should consider the application. Now the power is delegated to the Financial Secretary. Now members may ask why this power is delegated to the Financial Secretary instead of Bureau Chiefs. Now, under Cap 370, the leading Bureau Director is the Secretary for Transport and Logistics. So for him to make an application, his superior, that is the Financial Secretary, should be the approving official. Page 178 to 180, no amendment. Mr. Andrew Lam. A point of background. I know that there is no amendment here, but after reunification, for 1B2, it says the Chief Executive in Council, and then 1B3, it says the Governor in Council. I'd like to know when changes will be made. Why don't you make use of this exercise? I will come to that. There will be amendments in due course. Yes, please continue. Page 181 to 186. Publication of notices and the relevant requirements relating to the land resumption notice, section 14, and then section 16, notices of creation of easements or other rights, and then page 185, section 17, and the notice of road closure thereunder. We will impose requirement for the notices to be published on the website, and we will also revert to the original requirement of publishing notices in the newspapers. Page 187, interest. Modeled on the requirement in Cap 124 about the changes to the calculation of interest, we will remove the original provision to be replaced by a new reference interest rate. And that's page 187 and 188. Please continue. Page 189, a miscellaneous provision. There is a legislative proposal under the minor works mechanism. We need to update section 36C. Mr. Louis Long. Sorry, Chairman, I'd like to go back to section 33. You propose to delete the latter part of the paragraph, and that is the rate of interest to be decided by the Lands Tribunal. Subsection B here provides the date on which the interest rate is to be determined. Now, apart from determining the period for which the interest should apply by the Lands Department, the Lands Tribunal, the tribunal also decides the rate. If it's different from the HIBOR rate, which should be used as a reference. Thank you, Mr. Long, for his question. Now we will fix the rate of interest to the 1-month HIBOR rate. It is different from the previous rate used, that is not lower than the interest rate paid on at a 24 hours call. Now we propose to delete the provision about the Lands Tribunal determining the rate of interest. Well, as per previously discussed, as this interest rate has been fixed, there is no need for the Lands Tribunal to make a determination. This may be related to the question previously asked, whether the interest rate could become higher. I think this addresses the comment.
Mr. Louis Long. So once this bill is passed, the power of the Lands Tribunal to set the interest rate will be deprived. Is that the case? Ms. Chong? Indeed, the Lands Tribunal will no longer have the jurisdiction to set the interest rate. That's our policy intent. Now, we used to put it as a rate no less than the deposit rate subject to 24 hours call. Some landowners want a better interest rate, so they take the case to the Lands Tribunal. So for those with the financial means or those who simply have more resources, they could take the case to the Lands Tribunal for a better interest rate. But there are others who don't have such a deep pocket. They would take the rate at deposit subject to 24 hours call. Since the interest rate was low, so now we want to align the interest rate. For all cases, they are subject to the same interest rate. And we also look at things in perspective, the interest rate and the compensation. Resumption affects the rights of a landowner, so compensation applies. Compensation is front and center. Any delay in paying out the compensation, the interest comes in. Now, we agree that we should pay interest when there is a delay in the payout of compensation. We want to pay the interest to the affected landowners at a reasonable level, and we want the Lands Tribunal to focus on the compensation itself, rather than being distracted by disputes over the interest rate. I get that. Compensation is about timely disbursement. The interest is there to compensate for the delay in the disbursement. The interest rate can be so low that even after a few years, it's a very small amount. So with this change, people will get a better interest rate. In the past, some comments came from members on the interest rate. So please make sure the payment is disbursed swiftly. At least give out the large part of it so that the affected landowners have access to the compensation quickly. That's more important than the amount of the interest. If you can pay the compensation early, then the interest will not even be a factor. Anything to add from you, Mr. Lewis Long? I agree with you, Deputy Chairman. Swift payment of the compensation would mean the interest makes little, if any, difference. So we need a performance pledge. Say you take the land and you have to pay the compensation by a certain date. If that can happen, then the landowners will be assured. Anything to add from the government or any response? Permanent Secretary, we covered this point at the last meeting. We agreed on this point. The focus is on swift payment of, or rather, title checking. As we said last time, we would compile guidelines accessible to the trade too. Mr. Lewis Long was asking for KPIs or key performance indicators. We can give some thought to that. Please continue. Page 190, section 37. This is the offer back that we discussed in the past. After the works are done, some land is freed up under the existing provisions. Before the government offers the land to anyone else, the government has to first consider offering the land back to the original landowner. Now, but then the land is already resumed. The original landowner has received the compensation. Now, since we rarely see cases where the original landowner was offered the land, under Cap 1519, there are similar provisions, but they don't have the offering back mechanism. So we align the provision here with what's under Cap 519. I don't have any objection to the amendment. We want to make good use of the land. In our trade, people want to make use of land for more greening. Mr. Chen Xiuhong. I have a question about section 37. In the bracket, some of the wording is crossed out, but there are parts that are kept. Amendment 29 of 1998, section 104. So since you are crossing out the text above that bracket, will you remove what's in the bracket too? Department of Justice, please. Thank you. The text in the bracket is not part of the law or part of the statute. The bracket wasn't there when this ordinance was first introduced. These are notes about edits to the statute. This is there for people to track where the law comes from. The notes are changed through a different process from the legislative process. In our editing process, we add or remove the notes there. Now, I get it. It's not part of the legislative process. The idea is that people will have an easier time to keeping track of the changes through these notes. But if you keep the bracket there and you cross out some of the text in the provision, people get confused. How is that normally dealt with, Mr. Chen? I don't think that will happen. Now, the Legislative Council's Secretariat kept the bracket there. In our bill, we don't have the bracket there. In the statute, we want to spell out the full journey of changes the statute has gone through. That way, the reader will get a sense of the history behind the statute. So the note there will stay. I'm just saying the changes are patchy. You're crossing out the bracket saying amended LN 180 of 1985. I believe there were other previous changes. Let me clarify. We don't just cross out the bracket. We will keep all those brackets, the note saying the origins of the text. Dr. Wendy Hong. There were discrepancies between the Chinese and the English text. In Chinese, there were two notes in the bracket, 1985 and 1997, but in English, it only says amended in 1985. Discrepancies between the Chinese text and the English text. In English, you're missing something there. And also the problem about deleting the notes in the bracket. Page 190. Section 37. Chair, I will address the point about the discrepancy. I don't have the original statute or the legal notice from 1985 or 1997, but my guess is that in 1997, only the Chinese text was amended in 1997. No change was made to the English statute in 1997. That's why you see the text there saying amended LN 3632 of 1997. I believe that may be the reason. So can the government take a look at this? This has to do with past events. So can the government provide supplementary information after the meeting? Dr. Hong, any other questions? No more questions? Let's continue. Section 37A. We discussed this proposal. This is also under Cap 124 and Cap 127. So even before the works expenditure is approved by the Finance Committee of the Legislative Council, the Secretary can go ahead to invoke Section 37A and under section brackets A to C in taking forward the works project. Please continue. Page 191, no change. Page 192. Section 47, Transitional Provision. 4 subsections. Subsection 4, this points to the amendment ordinance, which means the bill we are scrutinizing. Subsection 1 under Section 43. The plan say if it has been deposited with the Lands Registry, then there are mechanisms for the objections, etc. They will follow the old rules. Subsection 2, the offer back mechanism under Section 37. That section will apply no matter when the land was resumed. Subsection 3, the change in how we determine the interest rate. If the claim started before the bill is passed, then that claim will be processed under the old rules. That's Section 43. Mr. Louis Long. Chair. After this bill is passed, what will be the commencement date? Say, is it going to be a date at some time after the passage? Does the government have a date in mind? We mentioned this. The Secretary will designate the commencement date through Gazetted 2 months or so, now we will have to deal with something, say, guidelines under the town planning ordinance. So we have in mind a date that's 2 months after the Gazetted. So that commencement date applies to all 6 ordinances, a single date. Yes, that's the case. Let's continue. Schedule, a technical amendment. There are references to provisions under Cap 370. We are inserting Section 47 as the transitional provisions, so we are updating the references. Please continue. Page 194, all the way to page 219. They deal with the questions raised by Deputy Chairman and Mr. Chen. They are outdated terms, so we take this opportunity to amend these terms. So the Crown becomes government, Governor becomes Chief Executive, Governor in Executive Council becomes Chief Executive in Council. From page 194 all the way to page 219, that's what those changes are all about. Please continue. Mr. Rincon. A question about drafting. Back in 1997 to 98, there was an exercise amending the statute. How come these terms were left out? Shouldn't we be able to spot them easily with the computer? Just then, Dr. Wendy Hong raised a point. I wondered what happened in 1997 to 98. We could find it online easily. How come these terms were left out? Cap 37, for example, the wording was changed back then. Does the government know the reason?
Mr. Chan, do you know the history? Thank you, Chair. Simply put, I'm not sure about the reason adopted at the time. Like Ms. Kong said, there was an amendment, perhaps for some provisions. There were loose ends to be tied, but that's not the decision made by the law drafting division. Although we participated in the process, it's for the Policy Bureau to make policy decisions. Perhaps there were still outstanding issues to be addressed. The amendments, therefore, did not take place. Now, for the actual reason, however, I don't have information at hand to explain why some of the adaptive amendments were made. Now, I understand that I'm not trying to blame anyone, but in 1997, at the time of reunification, there were amendments, and then in 1998, there were adaptive amendments as well. And I'm just thinking whether we missed it out in the amendment, say, on page 194. So instead of going through each and every word, we just do a global search. We need to be careful. I thank Ms. Kong for her reminder. In this exercise, since we are making amendments to Cap 370, we undertook this exercise to check similar examples. Indeed, the Governing Council appeared in another piece of legislation. We did not deal with that term because the EEB is undertaking another exercise. All the legislation under the Bureau's purview will be dealt with under a separate exercise. That's why we are we're leaving them out here. No questions from members? So can I take it that about the change of expression and titles all the way to page 219 have been covered, and then we can now move on to the next ordinance. Just very briefly, we are amending CAP 370, and consequently we need to make amendments to other pieces of legislation as well. 358, 358AL, and also another piece of legislation about electronic trading ordinance. So members, please refer to page 257. This is Water Pollution Control Ordinance, CAP 358. Page 257, Section 8 of CAP 358, and that's page 256 in the English version. The amendment will be made to 3E because of the introduction of minor works mechanism. We need to include another section, that is section 16A under subsection 3E2. So that's a consequential amendment. Next, please turn to CAP 358AL, page 259 in the Chinese version, or 258 in the English version. We will put in the new reference interest rate. This has been explained in the Land Resumption Ordinance. And then page 261 in the English version. This is a consequential amendment to the amendments to the to CAP 358 or 370. Reference is made to CAP 370. As you can see on the left-hand side, you see the provisions of the Road Works Use and Compensation Ordinance, and then the applicable sections are listed in the following. As we have made changes to the relevant sections, the changes are reflected here, as you can see on the right-hand side. And then page 262, same amendment. On the left-hand side, you see repeal and substitute. As we copy certain provisions to CAP 358AL, in light of the Water Pollution Control Sewage Regulation, we need to make the corresponding changes. As you can see, we have deleted subsection 10. This has been rewritten. So by now there is no need to make this reference, as the section already applies to CAP 358AL. There is a similar objection handling mechanism and application for extension under 358AL. The approving official will be the Secretary for Environment and Ecology. This change is reflected here. Next, page 272 in the Chinese version, Electronic Transactions Ordinance. This is also mentioned in CAP 370. In Schedule 3 on page 271, about the service of documents, there are provisions in this schedule. Some documents can be served in person or by mail, and now the electronic service of documents will be accepted. We've deleted sections 10, bracket 1, 3, and 29.1, and we'll be discussing 11 because The sections already provide the method of service of documents by electronic means. The relevant references to these sections will be deleted. Please continue. Page 220. That is the Railways Ordinance. The last piece of ordinance will be going through. CAP 519 is largely modeled on CAP 370. So basically, we'll be making the same changes to CAP 519 as in CAP 370. First, about the method of publication of schemes, we will include the new requirement for the scheme to be published on the website, and we'll also revert to the original requirement of notices in newspapers. And then the next page, instead of district board in the English version, we will change it to the district council. No amendment to the Chinese version. Page 222 and 223, objections. Similar to CAP 370, for 3E on page 221, we refer to the complaint lodged on the ground of compensation not being dealt with. This will be dealt with in another mechanism. And then the subsequent subsections about the objection handling mechanism. Subsection 4 about the revised scheme, the objector may lodge an objection within the time frame. And then for subsections 7 and 8, this is referring to objection in writing and how it should be handled. And then procedure after publication of scheme on page 223, you'll see the new subsections on the right-hand side. The time frame for lodging objections will be shortened from 9 months to 5 months, as you see in 2AA. The other amendment is in relation to 2B, about application for extension. Instead of the chief executive, the financial secretary will be handling this application in line with CAP 370. And then page 224, minor works. For minor works covered by the Railways Ordinance, comparing to the minor works in CAP 370, the scope is much smaller. After gazetting the scheme, the majority of things will be dealt with. It is therefore rare that the minor works under CAP 519 will be invoked. We just want to take this opportunity to make the corresponding changes. Our proposal is in line with that for 370. CAP 370. I'd like to draw members' attention to B. We are clarifying this point because when it comes to railways, we talked about a scheme, and we specify that this is not a scheme that has been approved, but rather a scheme intended to be proposed. It can still be covered by the minor works mechanism in order to cover, say, advanced works not yet approved. Mr. Chan Siu-Hong. On terminology, on page 224, 15, minor works, the new provision 2B, or rather, section 15, subsection 1C, and then the powers required to be exercised by, I see the word required, but I see the use of Chinese word here. Do you intend to allow flexibility? Because in other sections I see the word in Chinese meaning necessary instead of the secretary having the need to do so here. Is that the intention, Mr. Chan? You have a homophone here, but as members already explained, the administration agreed with the administration. One of the meaning is that it is required or it is necessary. For the other meaning of the other word, it means requirement. There is a difference between these two Chinese characters. The same as according to the drafting principles, we consider the context and the objective and use the most appropriate word. No follow-up. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam. You explained that a scheme intended to be proposed is also covered in the minor works. Let's say in a railway project, I want to conduct geotechnical investigation for a certain section. Is it that previously approval is required? I don't understand the difference between the current situation and what happens after you relax the requirement. Is there a special consideration?
Ms. Tam, we want to clarify the rules, just like what members have in mind. We want our frontline officers to be comfortable about invoking the provisions. We talked to the Highways Department. We had this impression that if you don't spell things out clearly, then the officers are not sure if they can go ahead. So we have this proposal, spell things clearly, so the officers will have clearer rules to go by. Mr. Andrew Lam. A follow-up. Proposed scheme. Do we have a legal definition for proposed schemes? At which point does a scheme become a proposed scheme? I think this is in contrast to an approved scheme. So you have schemes at a mature stage, but it has yet to secure the Chief Executive in Council's approval. So that's what we have in mind. Mr. Andrew Lam. Approved scheme. The approval comes from the secretary or a director. That's from the Chief Executive in Council's approval. Permanent Secretary. For large-scale railways project, the CE in Council approves the project. Before the scheme is approved, smaller scale works or minor works are carried out. Now, for proposed schemes, the scheme has yet to reach the Chief Executive in Council. Schemes intended to be proposed, so for like exploration, etc., bracket B deals with that sort of situation. I put that question to you for this reason. A scheme intended to be proposed. A department wants to put a proposal to the Chief Executive in Council. So what's the definition for a scheme intended to be proposed? Who proposes the scheme? We will study this matter to see if we can clarify the provision. Next, Dr. Wendy Hong. My question also has to do with bracket B. If the scheme is rejected in the end, so all the effort will go to waste. Ms. Tam? Under the Railways Ordinance, we don't often see these minor works. That's the experience from the ground. a project goes through many stages on the drawing board, especially for railways project. There is preparations, there's a concept, and then the project comes out, goes to the Executive Council for the discussion and approval. It's a long process. We are confident that with the advanced preparations done right, we will rarely see a rejection in the end. Mr. Chen Xiu-hong. Thank you. For minor works under the Railways Ordinance, the wording here is largely the same as under Cap 370, but something stands out here under the Railways Ordinance. There's a wording, authorized. Is it because the railway operators involved, third parties are involved, so authorization is needed? Now, even for normal works projects, you need some kind of authorization. So how come we see the word authorized here under Roman numerals 1, 2, 3 here? Now, under the Road Works Use and Compensation Ordinance, the Secretary has to believe that there is minimal adverse effect on the commuters, people nearby. But then on the left here, it says, and it to a certain extent, it already deals with the point here, a closure of a road which, in his opinions, will not affect the traffic, interfere unreasonably with the normal flow of traffic. That's a convoluted way to draft it. So how come we have the word authorized here? And how come and we don't use authorized under the Roads Use Works Compensation Ordinance? And how come we have this convoluted sentence here? Ms. Tam? The provision is drafted here in this way for the reason cited by Mr. Chen. That's why we use the word authorized here. Now, on the drafting, we can revisit it. Mr. Chen gave us suggestions on whether we really need some of the words there, whether we can simplify the drafting. We will study that matter after the meeting. Next, Mr. Andrew Lam. I want to write on the point raised by Dr. Wendy Hong and Fabia. Fabia's reply gave me something to worry about. Let's take the Sha-Tin Central Link as an example. Relics were uncovered during the exploration work. You can prevent unnecessary work down the road. Now, I won't call it work going to waste, but we have to be careful here. In practice, when you work on finalizing the alignments for railways and roads, the exploratory stage can reveal problems. So I would like the government to clarify the amendment exercise is about boosting speed. We have to weigh the benefits. As Mr. Andrew Lam was saying, will all the advanced work pay off? But then sticking to the piecemeal approach will mean the process takes a long time. If you take forward the steps in parallel, what are we gaining? Is that optimal use of resources for the best outcome? Permanent Secretary, you made a good point. 2 points. On the wording, under bracket B, we can see if we can spell things out more clearly on what we mean by a scheme intended to be proposed. The Secretary has to consider all the circumstances. Say it's a railway project. The project has not come before the Executive Council, and then the Secretary exercises the power under the minor works mechanism. The Secretary has to consider the risks and assess the risks. In the administrative guidelines, we will spell out clearly the rules, reminding the departments that there are factors they have to consider. Please continue. 226, page all the way to page 230. They have to do with how notices will be given. The notices will go up on the website designated by the Secretary. We will also put back the requirement about the newspaper ads. Please continue. Page 231. This is about the interest rate. We cover that under Cap 330. So the Lands Tribunal will no longer have the jurisdiction over setting the interest rate. We have already explained the rationale. Page 232. This is how the new interest rate will be calculated. Page 233. This is just like what we had under Cap 370. We're making changes to the minor works mechanism. So the provision on the minor works will be updated. Page 234, Section 42A. For the railways project, even when the works expenditure is not approved by the Finance Committee yet, the government can go ahead with the railway project. Section 48, Transitional Provisions. Just like what we saw before. Subsection 1. Before the commencement of the bill, projects that already came in will follow the old rules. That's subsection under subsection 1. Subsection 2, the interest rate. Claims that have already started before the commencement date will follow the old rules. Page 236. A technical amendment in the schedule. There are references to certain sections, so we have to update the references, including the transitional provision being section 48. So now we are done with the scrutiny of Cap 519. Any other ordinances we have to go through? So after all these meetings, we are done with the clause-by-clause scrutiny. We have had a discussion. There are matters arising from today's discussion. We will need replies from the government, so please ensure you can provide the replies. There will also be committee stage amendment. So please give us the draft. The next meeting will be on June 9th at Friday, 8:30. We will have a 2-hour meeting. Please provide the information in good time so that we can have a look. For members, if you wish to move any amendment, please provide them in good time. Mr. Louis Long. Chair. When we receive further information, please be sure that LC paper CB 1362/2023 bracket 1. I submitted that submission earlier on. I'm sure the Permanent Secretary will go through the submissions to see what was missed in the past so that at the next meeting we can cover them. Mrs. Regina Ip, the chairwoman, will be here to chair the meeting at the next meeting and have a discussion. If there are no other questions, then we can wrap up the meeting today. Anything else from you, Permanent Secretary? Nothing in particular. Chairman, you gave us a great summary, and thank you for chairing the meeting through the scrutiny. The next meeting will be on June 9th. Our colleagues are working hard on this. For any outstanding replies, we will provide the information before the next meeting. We are preparing the draft CSAs so that hopefully we can discuss them at the meeting on June 9th. Nothing in particular from the Secretariat. If there's no other business, I will adjourn the meeting here. Thank you.